Hi, this is Kathy Mulcahy, and because I've had a lot of requests from students who struggle through nursing school exams, I'm making a series of videos on test taking. So part one is just going to be basic study skills. Now, if you're new to your clinical nursing program, you might never have encountered questions like the ones you start to see on nursing exams. So you may have memorized bullet points on your PowerPoints, or you highlighted your textbook and learned all the definitions of things and learned to identify structures, but you never had to apply that information to a situation or make a decision based on it. So that strategy might have worked well for your other coursework, but it didn't prepare you to answer questions that ask you to take a limited amount of information in a scenario, apply it to a patient, and maybe prioritize that information or pick the best answer out of 2 or 3 correct answers in a 4-option question. So this video series should help you understand how to prepare for exams, how to answer questions, and how to generally be successful with your exams. If you're already in a nursing program and you're kind of far along and you're struggling, this video can also help you. Some of the information is pretty basic, but you might still find some strategies that help you as you move through your program. Sometimes nursing school starts off kind of simply building foundational skills, and if you maybe worked in healthcare, you didn't have to think too hard. Those things made sense, but then the information starts getting more complicated. And the skills that were okay and got you through fundamentals might not be okay for specialty areas such as oncology or peds or critical care. So if you're struggling, it might be helpful to look at your current strategies and compare them with what I'm giving you and see if there's something there that you can use. So first, let's talk about basic study skills and strategies that will help you learn and apply your content better. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is organize yourself and budget your time. So on the first day of class, your teacher hands you a syllabus. Take that syllabus and put all of the important dates into the calendar. That includes things like care plans or other written assignments, test days. If you have things like ATI or HESI or Kaplan and you have to schedule those, make sure you have those. Those of you that have to schedule lab time, put that into your planner. Now you have to put in study time and make it non-negotiable. Okay? Figure on spending 2 hours outside of class for every hour you spend inside class to study for an exam. That's a basic rule of thumb, and that can mean 1 hour of preparation before you go to class and 1 hour of review after your lecture, but your mileage may vary. You might need more time if it takes you longer to read, or if you have trouble paying attention while you read. If you have a learning disability, if English is your second language. So you need to make sure that you're budgeting enough time outside of class to cope with the workload. Make sure that you have time allotted that is free from interruptions and distractions. Those of you who have kids are probably going to find that the toughest. But remember that cramming at the last minute is a great way to forget everything you learned and to get really stressed out on test day. So it's the number one waste of time to spend 12 hours the night before a test trying to teach yourself content that you maybe had 3 or 4 weeks to learn. And keep in mind that nothing you learn in nursing school is disposable until maybe after NCLEX, and even then you're going to need a lot of it for clinical practice. Your coursework builds on itself, and adding new material that you learn to your foundational knowledge takes time to build. So make sure that you're setting that time aside. Pace yourself. Don't wait till the last minute. So in nursing school, you hear a lot about prioritization and delegation, and most of the time we use that in the context of a clinical situation, but you can start right now with your very own schedule and your very own life. If you want to be successful, sometimes you need to take a look at your other commitments and decide how you're going to get everything done. A traditional student might have 15 credits and you have multiple courses that you juggle, and you need to make time for each one of those courses. Returning students or non-traditional students might have jobs or families, and you're going to have to decide how you're getting it all done. The one thing that's certain is nursing school is temporary. and there is an end to it one way or the other. If you want it to end in a degree and the right to sit for NCLEX, you might need to push some things out of the way. I mean, I know you have to pay your bills, but really kind of look at your budget and see if you can cut back at work if you can. If you're working crazy hours or you're saying yes to people for extra shifts because you want to be the nice person, start to get a little selfish and really put yourself first for these few years that you're in nursing school. If you're a mom and you can get some help from someone with the house and the kids, that would be ideal. Really let other people help you if you can, and it's okay to lower your standards a little bit. You can buy cookies instead of baking for school parties, and sometimes a square meal comes in a cardboard box from the pizza guy, and that's okay. For a little while, nursing school is temporary. If you do work outside of school, look for a schedule that gives you a little flexibility, and let your employers know that for these couple of years you're going to be working on this, and that it's really important to you that you have some flexibility for study time. Maybe put your request in as soon as you get your syllabus for days off that you need. You might also be eligible for student loans that help pay for living expenses. This is something that I've heard from other instructors. Be careful not to overborrow. That's always a danger. But definitely look for any source of financial aid that lightens your load, and that can include scholarship. It can include employer reimbursement, anything that sort of makes your life a little bit easier. Okay, so my third point is that you need to come to class prepared. And I know people kind of groan and roll their eyes when I say this, but as an instructor, I can tell you, people who come to class prepared to work are in much better shape when it comes time for the exam. Lectures are kind of difficult to attend to sometimes, and the studies have shown that when content's presented this way, students can forget up to 90% of it maybe an hour after they walk out the door. And there's where I hear things like, you never said that, or I don't remember this. It's because it's hard to remember everything that you sit down and hear for 2 hours. So if you're prepared for class, it's easier to pay attention to that lecture because you have a familiarity with the subject. So do the readings or view the PowerPoints, or if your instructor gives you a video or a voiceover PowerPoint, make sure you pay attention to that. Give yourself time to do that. The content can be so complex that hearing it once doesn't necessarily give you the kind of understanding you need to be able to apply it or to analyze the data. It may have been enough to get you through bio or anatomy, but it won't be enough for nursing. Make sure that while you're doing your prep work, you take notes on anything that seems difficult or complicated, or anything that's kind of fuzzy in your head. That way, when you're in class, you can ask questions while your instructor's there to answer them. And chances are, if you have a question, other people do too. If you don't prepare for class with whatever your instructor has assigned, the lecture might be over your head when you get there. You might not be able to participate in the active learning strategies. A lot of instructors like to use small group or quizzing or simulation in the classroom. And if you don't have any foundation, it's not going to make any sense to you, and you're not going to learn anything from that time. So budget your time wisely. Make sure you're spending enough time with the material that you build a base to be able to participate in class. So the fourth point I wanted to bring to your attention is to develop good listening skills. And this is hard. Nursing lectures are long. They're sometimes 3, 4, I have had lectures 5 hours long. And it can be really hard to sit still and listen to somebody read off their PowerPoint slides. So, additionally, if you have a short attention span, and a lot of us do, it can be tempting to check your phone, scroll Facebook, go cyber shopping, stare out the window, generally tune out during that lecture. But if you can learn to tune out those distractions and listen, you're going to notice that your instructor maybe repeats certain key phrases, uses a slower, louder, more emphatic tone or, to emphasize key concepts. They might even say something like, "This is important," or "Don't forget," and "Remember I said," or "This might be on NCLEX, hint, hint." Learn to pay attention to these cues. Teachers do this for a reason. For the most part, I would say we want you to succeed. And nothing is more frustrating to an instructor than taking the time to emphasize concepts that we're testing on, and we know they're on the test, and we try to give you those little breadcrumbs. Maybe I put I used to tell people, follow my stars, and I would put a star next to the key points in my lecture. And then people still sometimes get it wrong. If you were listening in on a faculty meeting after an exam, you would hear a lot of people say, but I told them to remember this. So learn to pay attention to those cues. Also, if your instructor gives you handouts or writes something on the whiteboard or otherwise calls attention to it, sit up and take notice. Frequently, an instructor might even use a story to get an important point across. I had a friend, Alex Davis, who used to teach psych, and he would tell stories about the paranoid patient that he had to get food from out of the vending machine, and everyone's like, oh, there he goes again telling stories. And wouldn't you know, on his exam was a question about a patient is suffering from paranoia. How does the nurse get him to eat? And the answer was something along the lines of take him to the vending machine. And when people got it wrong, he got really annoyed. Although some instructors can get off on tangents, don't assume that the stories your instructor tells you are just, nostalgia. They're walking down memory lane. A lot of times there's something buried in those stories that you can use to understand some key concept that they know they're going to test on. So listening is of primary importance. Bring your coffee, bring your NoDoz, whatever it is that keeps you awake. All right. Okay, so this next section is about taking notes. Now, recording lectures, I just want to say a word about that. Some instructors will let you, some won't. Some feel that it discourages participation because other students may realize that they're being caught on tape. Some feel really just funny about it. They're afraid they might say something that gets misconstrued. But if your instructor does allow you to record a lecture, it might be worthwhile for you to do so. Make sure you get permission first, but especially if you're an auditory learner or you speak English as a second language and you need to be able to sort of replay that to make more sense out of it, it might be helpful to you. Now, no worries if you can't record or you can't get permission. You still need to learn to take notes, even if you can. You're not a court stenographer, so don't write down every single word your instructor says or try to. What you're going to do is listen for the key points. So a really good format for taking notes, let me get that back up there. This is called a Cornell note. And this section in here where it says notes about key points, this is where you're going to kind of free form your notes, sort of write as you're listening, anything you think might be important. Okay, so then this margin area right here that says key points, this area here can be used for anything that your instructor calls attention to. You know, those cues that they give, like follow my stars, or listen to this, or remember I said, or don't forget, this is important. Those things can go in that key point section. Also in that key point section, I want you to write down any questions that you have about the material. You don't want to necessarily interrupt a lecture because that's sort of disruptive to the whole class. But if you put those notes and questions in the margin, then when something's not clear, you can raise your hand when your instructor gives you a break or when you're about to end class and clarify those things. Most good instructors will leave some time at the end of every lecture for questions. Sometimes you run out of time and it can't be helped. But that's a good place for those things. And then, let's see, this section in here, the summary section, this is when you go back later over your notes, which you're going to need to do. You're going to summarize what it was that you learned. What did your teacher say? What were these key points? And that's important. That helps you synthesize all this information and make sense out of it and build sort of a structure of knowledge in your head. Okay, so that's a Cornell note, and that's actually a very good tool to use. So let me just kind of erase what I've done here and get this shrunk back down to normal. And now I have another tool that you might be able to use, and this is helpful if your nursing instructor uses a format that follows the nursing process through a particular problem. So say your topic is fractures, and your nursing instructor is going through it using a nursing process approach. Well, you can either take notes in this format or reorganize them in this format when you get back. But ADPI stands for Assessment, Diagnosis, Planning, Intervention, and Evaluation, all the steps of the nursing process. And the reason that I mention this is that that is what's going to help you organize the material in a way that helps you stay patient focused. And then when you get those scenarios, like a nurse is caring for a patient with a compound fracture of the right femur, okay, what are the assessment findings that I need to be aware of? What are the problems that I might identify? And how do I plan my care? What do I do about it? And how do I know it's effective? So ADPI kind of keeps you focused on the way that nurses think. So that might be something that's helpful to you too. I would really advocate that you take the notes in the Cornell note format and then maybe look at it from an ADPI perspective when you're home and you're looking at those notes again. It is really super important, by the way, to review your notes. It's not just the act of writing them, which is helpful, or typing them. Bring a fully charged laptop if you want, and type your notes out, and that's perfectly fine. When you get home and you review your notes, see if there's still anything left that's muddy. You've done the prep work and now you've been to the lecture and you've taken notes and you've read your notes. If there's anything that's not clear to you, this is where you want to use that hour after your lecture to clarify that by going through your textbook. If it's still muddy, email your teacher, or you can ask other people in your study group, which is a concept we'll get to in a few minutes. So now I want to go over some textbook basics. You're going to get real familiar with your textbooks. Try not to read them like novels. I think that's where people really get lost. The reading assignments in nursing courses are very substantial, and the information can be very dry when we're looking at it in a purely theoretical way. So my advice is this. Go to the beginning of the chapter, skim the objectives, then look at stuff in bold, look at stuff in italics. These are the things that the author thought were super important for you to know. Most textbook chapters start off with their units start off with basic anatomy and physiology. If you have a strong grasp of that from your science coursework, you can skip that section, and then you can go back if you need a review of a particular system or a particular part of a system. Look at the tables, look at the graphs, then go back and read each section one at a time. This is where I mean, don't read it like a novel. Pause to reflect on what each section is about and whether or not you understand the material before going ahead to the next section. It can be really easy when you're reading this dry material to keep reading without ever really understanding it. I don't know how many times I've gotten 5 pages into a textbook chapter and realized I know not a single thing of what the author was trying to tell me. So stop at the end of every little section and see if you can summarize it. Take note of any questions or muddy points you have. You can use those good old Cornell notes to do that. You use the body of the paper to take notes. If the text has bullet points or something like that, you can format it that way. Make sure all your questions or key concepts are in the margin. And then at the bottom, make sure you understand it well enough to write a 1-sentence summary. Then, after you're done reading the book, you can read the chapter. Read the little bullet points at the end, see if they make sense, see if they sound familiar. If they do, the next step is going to be to quiz yourself. Use your electronic resources in your textbook. Most of them have them. You might have to scratch off the little code inside the book. Go on the website. There is a wealth of information there to you. I've pointed it out to students so many times they never even knew it was there, and at the end of the day, when they pass their exam, they say, that was so helpful. Thank you for showing me that. You can take your NCLEX workbooks. Now, if you're a beginning student, you're probably going to need something like a Fundamentals for Success book or something like that. Find out whatever you didn't know, whatever questions you got wrong, and go back and read the rationale. Even if you got the question right, but you're not sure why, you think you guessed, read the rationale. If you have particular trouble with it, write the rationale out on the piece of paper. That'll help you remember it. Lastly, look for a way to put that information in context. Maybe you had a patient in clinical with the same problem that you're reading about, or maybe you know somebody who has a similar problem. Maybe you can make, an imaginary patient, or you can pretend that your mom has a problem with nutrition, or, what if your grandma had a stroke and she needed a tube feeding, if that's your concept. Find a way to put a patient in the middle of that information and really try to imagine yourself doing that focused assessment, identifying the nursing diagnoses, making a plan of care, knowing what your nursing interventions are, and knowing how they're effective. Try to get there with anything that's really complicated or difficult for you. You might even take the stem of an NCLEX style question and turn it into a little case study. But just take what you've read and try to apply it to a real or hypothetical patient. That way, this information that's in the textbook, that's a bunch of words on a page, comes alive for you and becomes the foundation for the way a nurse thinks, which is what you need to do to pass your exams. It's what you need to do to pass NCLEX. It's what you need to do to practice safely. So that's what I would suggest with that. Again, textbooks are dry. Use the resources. Look at all the fancy stuff, all the tables, all the pictures, and try to make sense of it. Anything you don't understand, take notes. And this is why I'm saying to prepare for class, read the chapter. That way you know what you don't know, and you can listen very carefully when your instructor covers it and ask questions when it's appropriate. Okay, and the 7th tip I'm giving you is to find a study group. Studying with other people is a great way to make sure you're not missing anything. And if you read articles on student success, students who study in the groups are often better off than those who don't. And that makes sense because everybody tends to remember something different. And people have different strategies that they can share. So if you have a weak point, someone else might be stronger, and vice versa. Couple of tips: make sure that you're not studying with only the weakest students. Frequently, what other instructors and I have found is that students study with their friends, and it's not always necessarily the best method of finding a study group. You certainly want to have people that you like, who you feel comfortable with, but at the same time, if everybody in a study group is averaging around 75 on an exam, something's the matter. So when you're looking for a study group or potential study partners, try to look for the people who are always on time, who seem to understand what's going on, the people who are functioning well in clinical. Try to find some people who can help build you up and not bring you down, because you can get lost if it's a group just full of people who are struggling. I know everyone struggles in nursing school, but there are people who struggle more than others. If you have a group like that, the potential is not that you're going to maximize your time and your strengths. The potential is more that the blind are leading the blind. So try to get a good mix of students. It's certainly okay to include the weaker students, just don't have a group that's solely comprised of them. And make sure that the time you spend in a study group is productive. Sometimes it breaks down into social hour or becomes a complaint fest. It's okay to vent, but don't waste precious time complaining or socializing when you should be working. Okay, and the last thing that I want to talk about is the use of supplemental resources. And I'm going to say that a lot of students never need to go to anything outside of their textbook and their professor. But if you're really struggling, these can be helpful. By the way, I do not get paid for the endorsement of any of these products. I don't even know what most of them do. They're just pictures I pulled off the internet. So resources can be resources in your textbook, and I would totally advise you to go to those first, because they're geared for exactly the type of questions you're going to see on the exam. And they're already paid for. You bought your book, so you're already entitled to use them. You don't have to spend your money on them. However, if that's not enough, if there's a study guide that comes with your textbook, you might consider purchasing it. The Made Incredibly Easy series is something that some students find helpful. I would leaf through it first and see if it's something you're interested in. Sometimes you can go on sites like Pinterest and find stuff like this. These little mnemonics, particularly for electrolytes and other kind of tricky concepts. They give you a way to remember things that might be a little bit difficult. You might get flashcards, but always think about what you're spending your money on. Are you going to use this resource? Are you using the resources you have? These things are really pricey. I've been to the bookstore and looked into them sometimes as like little door prizes and found that a little set of flashcards can run about 40 some odd dollars. And they aren't necessarily any better than making flashcards on a deck of index cards from your textbook. But, or looking on Quizlet. Quizlet's another website, although, anybody can post stuff on there, so be careful. As with all your internet resources, there are a lot of YouTube videos. Sometimes they're very helpful, sometimes they're not. But at least YouTube is sort of open access. So if you look at them, they may help your understanding. I've had a lot of students that can find videos on YouTube or Khan Academy that are really helpful. You can also go the route of private tutoring, but if you do this, vet your resources carefully. There's people on the internet, Wyzant's a tutoring service, or a few other tutoring services, but before you pay somebody a lot of money to help you with nursing content, vet them very carefully. Ask them what their qualifications are. Sometimes they have a master's in nursing education, and that's great. Sometimes they have a master's in nurse practitioner, and their understanding of the content might be a little over your head. That's okay. As long as they understand what your needs are and know how to explain things, it's fine. But you would want to kind of review that. Also look at websites. There are some really good sources of information on some of the more reputable websites. For example, if you're having problems with cardiac rhythms, American Heart Association has a video called Learn Rhythm. It's a Learn Rhythm course, but it's an online course that kind of helps you. Again, you have to pay for that. But those are some things that might help you. Again, I'm going to caution you, if you follow all of the other advice that I gave you about listening and taking notes and reviewing those notes as part of your post-class work, and quizzing yourself, questions, all the NCLEX style questions you can do on that topic, reading rationales. You really might not need to go the route. You might need one good NCLEX review book to help you, or, maybe a made easy kind of guide. But if you're doing all of the other work, you may never really need it. I would check out Pinterest sometimes if you're having trouble with things, especially fluids, electrolytes, cardiac rhythms, anything that for you is particularly tricky. So that concludes our first video in this series. After this, I'll be making videos on how to answer prioritization questions, how to answer select all that apply. We'll do a little work on test anxiety. But that's enough for now. If you have any questions, just type them into that, to your comments on YouTube. Thanks. Bye.